There are stories that the earth remembers long after the people who lived them are gone. Stories pressed down into the soil the way leaves are pressed into the pages of a book, flat and permanent, and still carrying the shape of the thing they once were. The land of colonial Virginia is full of such stories. You can feel them if you stand in the right place at the right time, in the long flat fields where tobacco once grew in rows that stretched to the horizon, in the red clay earth that holds the memory of everything it has ever absorbed. The joy and the labor and the blood and the grief, all of it still there, under your feet, patient and permanent, waiting for someone to remember it out loud. This is one of those stories. It is the story of a woman named Nora, not the name she was given at birth, which was a name in a language her captors had decided did not exist, but the name that was placed on her the way a brand is placed, with heat and force and no asking of permission. Nora, a small word for an enormous person. She was 23 years old when this story begins, in the year of 1741, on a tobacco plantation in the Tidewater region of colonial Virginia called Whitmore's Landing. And she was already, by that age, a woman who had survived more than most people survive in a lifetime. Whitmore's Landing sat on a bend of the James River, its fields rolling back from the water in long, orderly rows, the tobacco plants standing in their seasons like green soldiers, tended by hands that did not choose to tend them. The plantation house was large and white and sat on a rise above the fields, visible from every part of the property, which was by design. The man who had built it, Aldous Whitmore, had understood that visibility was a tool of power, that a house which could be seen from everywhere reminded the people who worked the land who owned not only the land but everything and everyone on it. Aldous Whitmore had been dead for 11 years by the time this story begins. His son, Edmund Whitmore, now sat in the house on the rise and looked down at the fields and believed, as his father had believed, that this was the natural order of things. Edmund Whitmore was 35 years old, a man of the particular kind of authority that comes not from earning but from inheriting, the kind that sits lightly on its possessor because it has never been questioned in any way that mattered. He was not a cruel man in the way that history sometimes draws the slaveholder, not given to casual violence for its own sake, not a man who enjoyed suffering. He was something in some ways more dangerous than that. He was a man who had simply never allowed himself to fully see what was in front of him, who had constructed, with considerable intelligence and care, a view of the world in which what he was doing was not what it was. He kept his distance from the worst of what Whitmore's Landing required, delegated its ugliness to an overseer named Crail, and told himself, and his wife, and his God on Sunday mornings, that he was a responsible steward of what Providence had given him. Nora worked in the plantation house. She had been brought to Whitmore's Landing at the age of 14, taken from a coffle on the road from Richmond, purchased along with 3 others by Edmund's father in the last year of his life, and set to work in the kitchen under the supervision of an older woman named Hattie, who had been at Whitmore's Landing since before Edmund Whitmore was born, and who understood every current and undercurrent of the place, the way a river pilot understands a river, not from maps, but from the knowledge that keeps you alive. Hattie had looked at the 14-year-old Nora with eyes that assessed quickly and accurately and had made a decision. She would teach this child everything she knew. Not because the teaching would free her, nothing would free her, but because knowledge was the only protection Hattie had to offer, and she offered it completely. By the time Nora was 23, she could run a household of Whitmore's Landing size with a competence that Edmund Whitmore's wife, Margaret, relied upon absolutely, though she would never have said so in those terms, would never have acknowledged the dependency, because to acknowledge it would have required acknowledging Nora as something more than property. Nora managed the kitchen, the linen, the preserves, the candle-making, the seasonal preparations that kept a house of that size functioning through Virginia's long hot summers and its brief cold winters. She did all of this with a quiet efficiency that was not servility but strategy, because Hattie had taught her that the woman who is indispensable is the woman who is least easily disposed of. And in the world of Whitmore's Landing, indispensability was a kind of armor. She was not happy. Let that be said plainly. No honest telling of this story can dress what Nora's life was in the language of endurance and dignity, without also saying clearly that it was a life she had not chosen. A life built on deprivation so profound and so systematic that most of the people reading or hearing this story cannot truly imagine it from the inside. She had been taken from everything she had known at 14. She did not know if her mother was alive. She did not know where the other people from her village had been taken, which ships, which shores, which fields. She had been renamed, rerouted, remade in the image of someone else's convenience. And she had survived all of it not because survival was easy, but because she was, at her core, a woman of extraordinary internal resource, possessed of a self so deeply rooted that 9 years of systematic dehumanization had not been able to pull it out. She kept that self hidden mostly. That too was Hattie's teaching. Let them see what they need to see. Keep the rest for yourself. Give nothing away that you do not have to give. The self that moved through Whitmore's Landing, that answered to the name Nora, that said yes ma'am to Margaret Whitmore, and kept its face still during indignities that would have broken weaker spirits, was a surface, a necessary, carefully maintained surface. What lived beneath it? The woman who remembered, who observed, who held her own history inside her like a flame cupped against wind, was something Whitmore's Landing had never succeeded in touching. She had one friend in the fullest sense of the word. His name was Solomon. Solomon had been at Whitmore's Landing for 6 years when Nora arrived, brought there at the age of 12 from a plantation further south that had failed and sold its people. He worked in the fields primarily, with the hands that tended the tobacco through its long seasons, planting and suckering and priming and curring, the endless back-breaking cycle of a crop that demanded everything from the bodies that grew it. He was, by the time Nora was 23, a man of 26, broad-shouldered and deliberate in his movements, with large, careful hands and a way of going still when he was thinking that made him look, at those moments, like a man carved from the same red clay as the Virginia earth around him. He had a low voice and spoke slowly and sparingly, not from lack of thought but from the habit of a man who had learned that words, like all things of value in his world, should not be wasted. They had become friends in the small, careful ways that friendship develops in places where friendship is not encouraged and privacy does not exist, in snatched minutes at the edge of the day, in the early morning before the work began, in the brief Sundays that were theoretically a rest, but in practice, merely a different kind of labor. They talked in those minutes with the concentrated urgency of people who know they may not have long. And what they said in those conversations, Nora kept more carefully than she kept anything else in her life, because Solomon talked about things that no one else at Whitmore's Landing talked about. He talked about the world beyond the plantation. He talked about the North and what he had heard of it, from the rare travelers who passed through, from the whispered network of information that moved between the enslaved people of the Tidewater region like water moves underground, invisible and persistent. He talked about what a life that belonged to oneself might look like. He did not talk about this as fantasy. He talked about it the way an engineer talks about a bridge that has not yet been built, with specific interest in its structure, its requirements, what it would need. Nora listened to all of it with the focused attention she gave to everything that mattered. She did not allow herself to hope in the way that hope is usually meant, that luminous, forward-leaning feeling that assumes the future will be better than the present. Hope of that kind was a luxury that Whitmore's Landing had not permitted her, but she allowed herself something more precise, more practical. She allowed herself to pay attention to the possibility, to note it, to file it carefully away. She loved Solomon. This also must be said plainly, without sentiment or softening, because it was a plain and enormous fact. She loved him not with the breathless urgency of a young girl's first attachment, but with the deep, specific love of a woman who has known enough loss to understand exactly what she is valuing when she finds something worth valuing. She loved his stillness and his deliberateness. She loved the way he listened to her fully, without waiting for his turn to speak. She loved that he was the only person at Whitmore's Landing, the only person in 9 years, who had ever asked her what she thought about things, and then genuinely wanted to know the answer. She loved him with a completeness that she kept hidden, as she kept everything of importance hidden, because love at Whitmore's Landing was not safe. It was not safe for the same reason that everything of value was not safe there, because it could be taken. They had not spoken of it between them, not in the direct language that safer lives would have permitted. But it was there, understood, the way certain things are understood between people who pay close attention to each other. In the way he positioned himself between her and Crail, the overseer, when Crail was in one of his moods. In the way she left food for him at the edge of the kitchen garden on the evenings when she had something worth leaving. In the way they sat together on the rare Sundays in a particular patch of shade behind the tobacco barn, where neither Crail nor any of the Whitmore household was likely to come, and did not need to fill every moment of silence with words because the silence between them was its own kind of conversation. Hattie knew. Hattie knew everything that happened at Whitmore's Landing with the comprehensive awareness of a woman who had lived there for 30 years and paid attention to every minute of it. She watched Nora and Solomon with the eyes of someone who understood both the necessity and the danger of what she was seeing, and she said nothing for a long time. And then one evening when Nora was helping her bank the kitchen fire for the night, she said, quietly and without looking at her, that Nora should be careful. Not as a prohibition, not as a condemnation, as a warning from someone who had seen what happened to careful people when they forgot to be careful and had seen what it left behind. Nora said she understood. Hattie said she hoped so. They did not speak of it again. The summer of 1742 was the summer that Edmund Whitmore decided to expand the plantation's production. He had received a good price for the previous year's tobacco crop, had been encouraged by a merchant in Williamsburg who told him that the London market was hungry and the timing was favorable, and had decided to add 40 acres of new cultivation on the southern edge of the property, which meant clearing land and required additional labor. Edmund Whitmore solved this problem the way men in his position solved all labor problems. He purchased people. 8 men arrived at Whitmore's Landing in August of that year, brought from a trader in Norfolk. They arrived in the early morning in the back of a wagon and were brought to the yard behind the tobacco barn to be assessed and assigned. Nora saw them from the kitchen window, the way she saw many things at Whitmore's Landing, from a distance and in silence, noting everything. 8 men in various conditions, the particular conditions of people who had been in transit for some time and had not been treated well during it. She looked at their faces with the attention she gave to the faces of all newly arrived people at Whitmore's Landing, the searching, instinctive attention of someone looking for something recognizable, something that connected them to a world that existed before this one. She did not know any of them. She had not expected to. She turned back to the kitchen. Solomon was assigned to supervise the new men in the clearing and preparation of the new acreage, a responsibility that Crail gave him not out of respect, but out of the practical knowledge that Solomon was the most reliable and technically capable worker on the plantation, the one whose judgment could be trusted to get the work done, without requiring Crail's constant presence. Solomon accepted this responsibility without visible reaction, the way he accepted most things Crail assigned him, without the expression of anything that could be used against him. In the evenings of that August, Nora began to notice a change in Solomon. It was subtle, the kind of change that only someone who watched him as closely as she did would have detected. A new quality in his stillness, an additional layer, as though he was thinking about something so intently that even his habitual deliberateness had taken on a new density. He was less present in their Sunday conversations, or rather he was present in body, but some part of his attention was somewhere else, turned inward towards something he had not yet said. She waited. She had learned patience the way she had learned everything else important, from necessity. It was in September, when the new clearing was well underway, and the leaves were beginning to turn on the hardwoods at the edge of the property, that Solomon finally said it. They were in their usual patch of shade behind the tobacco barn, the light going amber in the late afternoon, the sound of the river just audible in the distance. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said, without preamble, that one of the new men knew a route north, that the man had tried it once before and been caught and brought back and sold south, and that the trying had cost him dearly, but that the knowledge of the route had not been taken from him, because knowledge cannot be taken from a person the way freedom can, because it lives inside and has no physical form to be confiscated. Nora sat very still and listened to every word. Solomon said the man believed the route was still viable, that the circumstances that had caused the previous failure, a miscommunication with a contact in a town called Fredericksburg, had been specific to that attempt and were unlikely to repeat. He said the man believed 3 people was the right number, enough to help each other, not so many as to be easily tracked. He said the man was willing to go again, despite everything it had cost him the first time, because he was the kind of person for whom the cost of not trying had finally come to exceed the cost of trying. He stopped talking and looked at her. She asked him when. He said he did not know yet. He said there were things to prepare, things to understand, that it was not a decision to be made quickly or carelessly. He said he wanted her to know that he was thinking about it, and that he was not thinking about it without thinking about her. She looked at him for a long moment, at the careful dark eyes and the hands resting still in his lap, and the particular set of his jaw that she had learned meant he was holding something with great precision to keep it from breaking. She thought about what Hattie had said. She thought about the 8 men in the wagon. She thought about 14 years old and the road from Richmond and everything that had happened since. She thought about the route north that a man had tried once before and been caught and brought back and sold south, and about what it meant that he was willing to try again. She said she wanted to think about it. He nodded. He had expected nothing less. He was not a man who would have respected any other answer. What Nora thought about, in the days and nights that followed, was not the fear, although the fear was present and was real and was specific in a way that fear is specific when you know exactly what the consequences of failure look like. She had seen what came back from failed escape attempts, had nursed the results of Crail's idea of discipline with her own hands, had held women who had lost people to the selling South that followed recapture. The fear did not require examination. It was already fully formed and required no additional thought. What she thought about was Hattie. Hattie was 61 years old. She had been at Whitmore's Landing since she was a young woman, had buried 2 children there, had nursed Edmund Whitmore through his childhood fevers, had fed and clothed and maintained the household of the Whitmore family for 30 years, and she was not going anywhere. Not because she had stopped wanting to, if she had ever allowed herself to want it, but because her body was no longer capable of the physical demand of a route north. And she had been at Whitmore's Landing so long and knew its particular geography so completely that she had become, in some terrible way, of it. The plantation was the whole of her world, not by choice, never by choice, but by the long, grinding accretion of time and deprivation. To leave Whitmore's Landing would be, for Hattie, to leave the only world that existed for her, and Nora understood this even though it broke her heart. The thought of leaving Hattie was the thing that came back every time she turned the question over in her mind. Hattie, who had found her at 14 and made her capable of surviving. Hattie, who had given her the only consistent form of care she had known since she was taken. Hattie, who had watched her and Solomon with knowing eyes and said be careful and meant it from love. She went to Hattie, not directly, not with the question laid out plainly, because even in the conversation she most trusted in this place, there were things better not said in full. But she sat with Hattie in the kitchen one evening after the household was quiet, and she said, carefully, that she had been thinking about things, about the future, about what was possible. Hattie stirred the pot she was stirring and did not look up and said that it was good to think about the future. Nora said she was afraid of leaving things behind that mattered. Hattie was quiet for a while, long enough that the fire settled, and the sound of it was the only sound in the kitchen. And then she said, still not looking up, that the things that mattered did not require a person's physical presence to go on mattering, that a person could carry what mattered with them, in the place inside them where the things that cannot be taken are kept. She said that to stay for the sake of someone who loved you enough to want you to go was not loyalty. It was only the appearance of loyalty. That real loyalty sometimes meant being willing to take the thing someone gave you and use it. Nora understood what Hattie was saying. She sat with it for a long time in the warmth of the kitchen, and then she reached across and took Hattie's hand and held it without speaking, and Hattie let her, and neither of them said anything else, because everything necessary had been said. She told Solomon yes on the following Sunday, simply the way she said most things, yes. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something move through his face that she recognized as relief. And beneath the relief something else, something she had no word for in the language she was required to speak at Whitmore's Landing, but which she recognized from something older and deeper in herself, from the language of her first home, the one that had no name at Whitmore's Landing because it had been declared not to exist. His name, the man with the root, was Ezra. He was 40 years old, lean and precise, with scar tissue on his wrists, and a steady, watchful quality that reminded Nora of a man who has been burned and learned exactly how close he can stand to fire. He was not talkative. When Solomon brought him to meet Nora in the early morning on the east side of the tobacco barn, Ezra looked at her with the particular assessment of a man who is calculating risk and said three things. He said he would not carry anyone who could not keep pace. He said if they were found he would not name the others, but he would not expect them to die for him either. He said the route was hard and the timing was tight, and there was no version of it that did not require things from a person that they did not know they had until they were required. Nora said she understood all three things. Ezra looked at her for another moment, and then he nodded. It was the kind of nod that is not friendliness but is respect, and respect from Ezra, she would come to understand, was not easily given and therefore worth having. They planned through the autumn. Not in long sessions, not in any way that would have been visible to anyone watching, but in the accumulated minutes of careful communication, small pieces of information passed in the course of ordinary days. The route, north through the forests above the river, avoiding the main roads, moving at night and sheltering in daylight. The contacts. A free black man named Joseph in Fredericksburg who moved goods between the town and the farms to the north, and who had, in the years since Ezra's failed first attempt, been confirmed reliable through channels Ezra trusted. The timing. Late October, after the tobacco harvest was in and before the deep cold of winter made the forests impassable. The supplies. Gathered in small amounts over weeks, hidden in a place beneath the tobacco barn floor that Solomon had known about for years and never used, a cavity left by the rotting of an old post that Crail had never thought to look at. Nora contributed what she could from the house. Food, preserved and compact. A blanket taken a little at a time from the household linen, so gradually that Margaret Whitmore, whose inventory habits were approximate at best, did not notice. A small knife from the kitchen that had been growing blunt and would not immediately be missed. She did each of these things with the focused, unhurried care with which she did everything, without haste, without guilt, because she had long since concluded that the moral weight of what she was doing was nothing beside the moral weight of what had been done to her, and her conscience, which was clear and well calibrated, confirmed this. She said goodbye to Hattie in advance, in the only way that was possible, in the gradual, gentle transfer of knowledge that took place over those October weeks. Everything Hattie knew about the household of Whitmore's Landing that Nora had not yet mastered, she taught. The particular weakness in the root cellar that needed watching, the way Margaret Whitmore's moods moved through her cycles and how to manage them, The list of the household's illnesses and what had worked for each. The location of the household records that Edmund Whitmore kept imperfectly and sometimes needed. All of it, given and received with the attentiveness of people who know that a transfer is taking place, that a chapter is closing, that the page is being turned. On the last evening before they were to go, Nora sat with Hattie after the house was quiet, and Hattie pressed something into her hand. It was small and smooth and slightly warm from Hattie's palm, a carved wooden figure, a woman with her arms raised, the carving worn smooth with years of handling. Hattie said she had made it herself, a long time ago, from a piece of the oak that had stood at the edge of the field before Edmund Whitmore's father had it felled. She said it was the only thing she had made for herself in 30 years at Whitmore's Landing, and that she wanted Nora to take it, not as a memento and not as a charm, but as proof. That Hattie had made something that was entirely hers, that the making could not be taken back, that wherever the figure went, the making of it went with it. Nora closed her hand around it and pressed it to her chest and held Hattie in both arms. And Hattie, who had not allowed herself to weep in a very long time because weeping required a privacy that Whitmore's Landing did not provide, pressed her face briefly into Nora's shoulder and allowed herself, just for that minute, the private luxury of it. They left at 2 hours past midnight on the 23rd of October, 1742, when the moon was in its last quarter, and gave just enough light to navigate by without being enough to make them visible at any distance. They moved in single file, Ezra first, then Nora, then Solomon, through the tobacco barn and out the back through the gap in the fence that Solomon had been widening incrementally for 3 weeks, so gradually that no one had noticed the change. The fields were harvested and empty, the plants down to their stalks, the red earth turned and quiet. They crossed the field in a low, fast walk, stayed below the tree line, reached the forest at the edge of the plantation's eastern boundary, and went into the trees without looking back. Nora looked back once. She had promised herself she would not, but she did. The plantation house sat white and high on its rise, every window dark. The fields, her fields, the ones she had not chosen and would not miss, but which were nevertheless the geography of 9 years of her life, stretched flat and gray in the thin moonlight. She looked at them for exactly one breath and then turned and followed Ezra into the dark. The first 3 nights were the worst. Not because of what happened, which was nothing, no pursuit, no voices in the forest, no sound of dogs, but because of the constant expectation of what might happen, the sustained high tension of waiting for disaster that is in some ways harder to bear than disaster itself. They moved at night, picking their way through the Virginia forest by the minimal light of the quarter moon and by Ezra's knowledge of the terrain, which was not the knowledge of maps but of movement, of the particular feel of the ground under feet that had moved it before. They sheltered by day in the densest cover they could find, lying still and close together for warmth, sleeping in turns while one remained awake. Nora found that the fear in action was different from the fear in anticipation. In anticipation it had been diffuse, surrounding, filling the space of thought. In action it was concentrated and specific, attached to actual sounds and actual decisions, manageable in the way that only real things are manageable, because real things can be responded to. She moved through the nights with a focused attention that used every sense she had, listening to the forest the way she had learned to listen to the sounds of Whitmore's Landing, for what was ordinary and what was not, for the specific silence that meant a human presence. Solomon moved behind her, steady and quiet, and sometimes in the absolute dark, when she could not see him, she could feel his presence the way you feel a large warm thing near you in the dark, by displacement and by a quality of the air. Sometimes he put his hand briefly on her shoulder when the ground was uneven, not pulling her back, only noting it, and she felt the weight of that hand as a thing entirely distinct from every other touch she had experienced at Whitmore's Landing, which had all been, in various ways, the touches of a world that did not acknowledge her right to herself. His hand on her shoulder in the dark of the Virginia forest was the hand of someone asking, not telling, offering, not taking. Ezra did not speak unnecessarily. He communicated in the dark with gesture, learned quickly and interpreted accurately by his two companions because they were people trained by their lives to interpret the signals of others rapidly and without error. He moved with the particular quality of a man who has been terrified before and survived it and knows, therefore, that terror is survivable, that the body continues to function inside it if you let it, if you do not fight it but simply move through it the way you move through water. On the fourth night, they heard dogs. The sound came from the south, distant at first, the particular baying of tracking hounds that is one of the most specific and feared sounds a person in their position could hear in that time and that place. All three of them stopped simultaneously and went completely still, listening, assessing distance and direction with the practiced speed of people for whom this calculation was life or death. Ezra said quietly, almost without sound, that the dogs were not on their trail. He said the sound was moving east, parallel to their route but not toward it, that it was likely a different pursuit, someone else's terror on a different road. He said it with a precision that was not coldness but a kind of professional steadiness, the steadiness of a man who had separated his survival from his emotion, because allowing them to coincide was a luxury he could not afford. Nora stood in the dark and listened to the dogs and felt the sound of them move through her body like cold water, and thought, with a clarity that surprised her by its specificity, of the woman with her arms raised, the carved figure against her chest. She thought of Hattie making it from the felled oak, alone, in whatever minutes she had been able to steal for herself across 30 years, and she felt the steadiness that Hattie had intended her to feel, and she kept moving. They reached the outskirts of Fredericksburg on the seventh night. The town was dark and still, well past midnight, the few lights burning in upper windows the lights of people who could not sleep or whose work ran into the night. They came in from the forest on the western side of town, following Ezra's knowledge of the approach, and found the house he was looking for on a narrow street behind the grain merchant's yard, a small house with a pile of timber stacked outside it that served, Ezra had told them, as the signal that the occupant was home and the contact was active. The timber was stacked. Ezra knocked at the door in a particular sequence. After a long minute the door opened, and the man inside, Joseph, looked at the three of them with eyes that had clearly been prepared for this and said nothing, only stood back and let them in. Joseph was a free man, a carpenter and small goods trader, a man of quiet authority in the narrow geography of his permitted life. His house was small and meticulously kept and smelled of sawdust and the particular mustiness of a place where windows were not often opened. He fed them without ceremony, bread and dried meat and water, and let them sleep through the day on his floor without asking them anything. He did not need to know for practical purposes. He was not warm in the way that warmth is easy, the warmth of people who have not learned to be careful. But he was reliable in the way that mattered more, the way of a person who had made a commitment and was going to keep it regardless of cost. He told them, when they woke in the late afternoon, that the route from Fredericksburg north was more complex than the section they had already covered. There were river crossings and open roads, and a 3-day stretch without a safe contact where they would be entirely dependent on the forest and their own resources. He told them this not to frighten them, but because they needed to know it and to know it fully. He said that the people who had the most trouble on the northern route were the ones who had been told it was manageable and found out too late that manageable was a relative term. Solomon asked about the river crossings. Joseph told him where they were and what the conditions would likely be at this time of year, the depth and the speed, which banks were likely to be watched and at what hours, how long each crossing would take. He told them what he knew of the farms and settlements between Fredericksburg and the Maryland line, and which ones to avoid and which, based on the fragmentary, passed-along intelligence of the network he was part of, were less dangerous than others. That night, in the small hours before they were to move on, Solomon and Nora sat together in Joseph's kitchen, while Joseph slept and Ezra kept watch at the window. The house was very quiet. The single candle on the table threw their shadows large against the wall behind them. Solomon said her name, the name she had been given at Whitmore's Landing, the name she answered to because she had no choice. He said it and then he paused and said he had been thinking for a long time that it was not her name, that somewhere there was a name that was actually hers, the one she had been given before, and that he did not know it but he wished he did. He said when they reached wherever they were going, if they got there, he would call her by whatever name she chose to take for herself, and that name, freely chosen, would be the one that mattered. She looked at him across the small table with the candle between them, and felt something open in her chest that she did not have a name for in any language, though she suspected the language of her first home had a word for it. A word for the particular sensation of a wound you had stopped expecting to heal beginning, very carefully, to heal. She said she had been thinking about her mother's name. She said she did not know if it would sound right on her. She said it was Amara. She had said it to herself, privately, in the dark of Whitmore's Landing, many times over many years, like keeping a flame alive in a closed room. Amara, her mother's name and perhaps someday hers. Solomon said Amara, said it quietly with the care he gave to things that deserved care. She held it in the air between them for a moment, and then she reached across the table and took his hand. Not the brief contact of the forest at night, but a full and deliberate taking of his hand. And he turned his hand and held hers, and they sat like that in the kitchen of Joseph's small house in Fredericksburg, Virginia, on a night in October of 1742. Two people who had found each other in the worst possible circumstances and refused, against all reasonable expectation, to stop being human. The next stage of the journey was the hardest. Joseph's description of it had been accurate. 3 days without contact, through terrain that was more open than the forests south of Fredericksburg, and therefore more dangerous, requiring them to move with even greater care, and to spend their daylight hours in concealment that was less reliable than the deep Virginia forest they had moved through before. The weather turned on the second day of this stretch. A cold rain that came in from the northwest and reduced visibility to a mercy on one hand, making them harder to see, and a difficulty on the other, making the ground treacherous and the cold insidious. Nora moved through the rain with the wooden figure pressed against her chest beneath her clothing, and thought about the oak tree at the edge of the field in Hattie's hands, and the 30 years that had been taken from Hattie that no freedom could give back. The first river crossing was the worst, not because of the pursuit, which did not come, but because of the river itself, the cold and the speed of it in the autumn rain, the absolute darkness of crossing moving water at 2 in the morning with no light and no certainty about the footing. Ezra went first, moving carefully, feeling the bottom with each step, the water at its deepest reaching his chest. Nora went second, her supplies held above her head, the cold of the river a shock so complete it became, past a certain point, almost peaceful, the way extreme sensation sometimes becomes a kind of stillness. Solomon came last, and she stood on the far bank and watched the darkness where he was and listened for his breathing, and did not breathe herself, until she heard him on the rocks at the bank's edge and then on the bank itself, water running off him, finding her in the dark and standing close. They did not stop to recover. They moved. On the third night of that stretch, the night before they were due to reach the next contact, a woman named Ruth who lived on the northern side of a settlement called Chapel's Ford, Nora lost the wooden figure. She did not know when it had happened. She reached for it in the early hours of that morning, the instinctive reaching she had developed over the weeks of the journey, and it was not there. She stood for a moment in the absolute dark of the forest and felt the absence of it with a physical specificity, as though a small, warm thing had been taken from against her heart. She knew she could not go back for it. She knew it was likely in the river. She stood in the dark and felt the loss of it, which was the loss of the proof Hattie had meant it to be, the proof that Hattie had made something entirely hers, and she grieved it with a speed and completeness that was the grief of a woman who had learned to grieve quickly, because the journey did not stop for it. But she carried the knowledge of it, the carved woman with her arms raised, the oak felled at the edge of the field, The 30 years of a life pressed into a small, smooth figure. She could not carry the object. She carried what the object had meant. She would carry it for the rest of her life, and she would make sure it was not forgotten. She kept moving. Ruth was everything Joseph had been and differently. Where Joseph was precise and reserved, Ruth was a woman of fierce and specific kindness, a free woman of color, a midwife whose services to the community around Chapel's Ford gave her a status that provided, if not safety, a degree of protection unusual for a woman of her position in that time and place. She fed them well and dressed the blisters that all three had developed and looked at Nora with the assessing, practical eyes of a woman, accustomed to looking at people in various states of diminishment and seeing the person inside. She told Nora, while the men slept, that she had sent 15 people north in the past 3 years. That 12 of them, as far as she knew, had made it. That the other 3 she did not know about, which was not the same as knowing they had failed. She said she told everyone the same thing, that the destination was not the point. That the journey itself, the act of moving toward freedom, was a thing that happened inside a person regardless of whether they physically arrived, and that no one could take that from them. She said she believed this. She said she had needed to believe it. Nora thought about this for a long time. She thought about the destination and what it represented, a life in which she could call herself by a name she chose, in which her body was her own, in which the love she had for Solomon could exist in the daylight rather than only in the dark behind tobacco barns and in the deep woods at night. She thought about the distance still to travel and the probability of making it, which Ezra had assessed in his characteristic terms. Not good, not impossible, that being as close to hope as Ezra permitted himself. She thought about the 12 who had made it and the 3 about whom Ruth did not know. She thought about Hattie, about the kitchen fire banked for the night and the hands that had held hers and the face that had allowed itself, for 1 minute, to press into her shoulder, about the transfer of knowledge, the careful, methodical giving of everything Hattie knew to the person she had chosen to give it to. She thought about what Hattie had said, that to stay for the sake of someone who loved you enough to want you to go was not loyalty. That real loyalty sometimes meant taking the thing someone gave you and using it. She was using it. She was in a midwife's kitchen in the Virginia countryside in the early hours of a November morning, 3 weeks and 40 miles from the life she had been required to live, and she was using every single thing Hattie had given her. The steadiness, the observation, the capacity to move through a world that was trying to unmake her without being unmade. All of it Hattie's given freely carried north. That was the answer she understood. The destination was not the absence of Whitmore's landing. The destination was the full, free existence of herself, of Amara, the woman who had been inside Nora all along, kept quiet and hidden and alive through 9 years, and everything those years had contained. The destination was the permission to be entirely herself, which was not a place on a map but a condition of being, and which she had been, in some essential and indestructible way, moving toward her entire life. She slept for a few hours on Ruth's floor and woke before dawn and woke Solomon and Ezra. And they thanked Ruth in the particular way of people who know that words are not equal to what they are thanking for, and they went north. The Maryland line was crossed on a cold, clear night in the first week of November, 1742. Ezra recognized the landmarks he was looking for, a particular arrangement of boulders near a creek crossing that had been described to him by the man who had told him about the route, and he stopped and stood for a moment in the dark. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The 3 of them stood together in the cold and the dark and let the fact of it settle over them, the fact of the line crossed, the Virginia soil behind them, and then they kept going, because the line on a map was not safety and they knew it and had never expected it to be. What came after was not simple or easy or immediately transformed. The story of Nora's life does not become uncomplicated the moment it crosses the Maryland border, because nothing in history and nothing in the lives of people who have been systematically deprived of everything is uncomplicated at its resolution. What came after was a different kind of hard, the hard of building a life without the materials that people who have always had their freedom take entirely for granted. Every practical thing, a name, a place to sleep, the means to eat, the legal fiction of a document that said she had a right to exist as a free person in a country that had not yet decided whether freedom was for everyone. Ezra had a contact in a town in southern Maryland, a free black community that had existed at the edge of a larger settlement for 20 years, a community of people who had arrived by various routes and in various states of what freedom could mean in that time and place, and who had built something there, not the freedom of the country's founding documents, not the freedom that was proclaimed for people who looked like Edmund Whitmore, but a working, breathing, daily freedom, the freedom of waking in the morning in a place you had chosen, of doing work whose product was yours, of being known to your neighbors by the name you gave yourself. Nora gave herself the name she had kept alive in the dark for 9 years. Amara. She said it to the woman who wrote it in the community's record book, the woman who kept the register of names, and the woman wrote it down without ceremony, as though it were an ordinary and obvious thing, which it was, and which the ordinariness of it made more extraordinary than any ceremony could have. She said it to Solomon, who took her hands in both of his and said it back to her, clearly, fully, with the same deliberateness he gave to everything that deserved to be said properly. Solomon became Solomon freely in that place, in a way he had not been Solomon freely at Whitmore's Landing, the name he had been given there becoming, in the new context, a name he chose to keep, because keeping a name can be as much an act of reclamation as taking a new one, depending on what the keeping means to the person doing it. He found work as a carpenter, the skills he had developed in the maintenance of Whitmore's Landing put now to the construction of a world he had chosen to be part of. He was good at it. He was good at most things he put his large, careful hands to. They were married in the spring of 1743, in the informal but deeply felt way of the community, witnessed by their neighbors and by Ezra, who was present as a man of few words and considerable emotion, standing at the back of the gathering with his arms crossed and his steady eyes holding something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to it, close enough to serve the same purpose. Amara stood in the morning light in a dress that a neighbor had given her, plain cotton, pale blue, the color of the sky above the James River on a clear morning, and she thought of Hattie's kitchen and the banked fire and the hands that had held hers, and she felt the presence of it in a way she had not expected, not as absence but as continuity, as though the love that had been given to her there was still traveling with her, still doing its work. She thought about Hattie every day. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about Amara, the woman who had been Nora. She did not leave Whitmore's Landing behind in the sense of ceasing to carry it. She carried it fully and permanently, every face and every loss and everything that had been taken, and everything that had survived the taking. She carried it because it was hers, because she had lived it, because the forgetting of it would have been a second erasure, a second theft, and she was done having things taken from her. She carried Hattie most of all. Hattie, who was still there, in the kitchen, banking the fire at the end of each day, teaching the next woman who needed teaching, giving what she had to give in the only way that was available to her. Amara could not go back, and she could not send for Hattie, and she could not change the 30 years that had been taken from the woman who had saved her. What she could do was remember. What she could do was make sure that the things Hattie had given her were used well, were passed on, were built into the life that Hattie's love and Hattie's teaching had made possible. She began teaching. This is what she did with the knowledge Hattie had given her. Not the knowledge of how to run a house that belonged to someone who did not deserve it, not the specific skills of Whitmore's Landing, but the deeper knowledge, the knowledge of how to survive with yourself intact, how to observe and adapt and endure and resist in the ways that are available when the obvious ways are not. She taught the women in the community, taught the young ones who arrived with that particular look of people who had crossed a great distance and were not yet sure they had truly arrived, the look she had worn herself, she imagined in those first weeks. She taught them what Hattie had taught her, and what she had added to it from her own living, the way knowledge grows when it is used. She became, over the years, a woman of consequence in the community, not of power in the world's terms. The world still had very particular ideas about whose consequence counted and what forms it was permitted to take, but of the kind of consequence that is real and lasting, the consequence of being the person others come to when they need the specific knowledge of how to keep going. She delivered children. She advised on household medicines using the knowledge she had accumulated at Whitmore's Landing and expanded from the plants of the Maryland countryside. She sat with the dying and with those who mourned the dead, and she was known as a woman who could be trusted with the things that could not be spoken to everyone. She and Solomon had children, 4 of them, born over the years in the small house that Solomon built and added to as the family grew, a house that was theirs in every sense of the word. The children were given names chosen with the deliberateness of people who understood what a name meant. She told them stories, all 4 of them, from the time they were old enough to listen. Stories of who they came from and what that meant, stories that included the difficult parts, because she believed that the truth of a history was more useful to a child than a comfortable version of it, that knowing what your people had survived told you something important about what you yourself were capable of surviving. She told them about Hattie. She told them in detail, the kitchen and the candles and the hands that held hers and the banked fire. She told them about the carved figure of the woman with her arms raised, made from the oak at the edge of the field, worn smooth with years of handling, lost in a river crossing in October of 1742 somewhere in the Virginia countryside. She told them that the figure was gone, but that the woman who had made it was not gone, not entirely, because she was here, in this telling, in this room, in the hands that had been taught by Hattie's hands and had taught other hands and would teach other hands after that, in the long, unbroken chain of what women give each other when the world refuses to give them anything else. The youngest child, a girl, sat with particular stillness during this telling, the way her father sat when he was thinking hard. Her name was Harriet. She had been given it deliberately, carried for a year in Amara's mind before the child was born, turned over and held the way the original Harriet, the original Hattie, had turned over and held the carved woman, until the shape of it was known completely. Harriet grew up and became a woman who remembered, and who taught, and who told the stories to her own children, and they to theirs, in the long persistence of memory that is the only kind of freedom that cannot be legislated against, revoked, or purchased and resold. The stories changed slightly in each telling, the way stories do, acquiring the specific texture of the person telling them, the specific concerns of the time in which they are told. But the center of them held the kitchen fire, the hands, the figure carved from the felled oak, the woman who made it and the woman who carried it and the river that took it and the love that carried on regardless. Amara lived to be an old woman. She died in the winter of 1789, at the age of 71, in the house Solomon had built and she had lived in for 46 years, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and the particular thick warmth of a house that has been genuinely lived in. Solomon had died 4 years before her, quietly and without surprise as he had done most things, and she had grieved him the way she had always loved him, fully and without performance, and had continued, because she was the kind of woman who continued. On her last night she asked her daughter Harriet to open the window that faced east, toward the direction from which the morning came. It was a cold night, the winter of 1789, cold and clear, and the air that came in from the window carried the particular quality of winter air, clean and without pretense. She lay in her bed in the cold air and looked at the dark rectangle of the window and thought, her children would say afterward, about something far away, about something she was looking toward. She was looking, perhaps, toward the tobacco fields along the James River, toward the kitchen of a house on a rise, toward the woman who had banked the fire and held her hands and let her go. She had never been able to go back, and she had never been able to send word, and she had never known, with any certainty, what had become of Hattie after she left. This was a grief that had no resolution and no comfort, only the long endurance of not knowing, which is one of the specific and particular griefs of people whose histories were deliberately fragmented and dispersed. She had endured it, she had not ceased to feel it. Both things were true. What she knew, what she had always known, was that Hattie had wanted her to go, that the going had been Hattie's last gift, that carrying the knowledge and the love and the teaching forward was not a substitution for what had been lost, but a fulfillment of it, the specific and intended use of a gift given by a woman who had understood that she was giving it. She had tried to be worthy of it every day of her life in the 47 years since she had walked out of the tobacco barn in the dark and into the Virginia forest. She believed, lying in the clean, cold air with the window open to the east, that she had not entirely failed in this. She believed that Hattie would have found it acceptable. Not perfect, because nothing in a life was perfect, and Hattie was a woman who did not deal in perfection, only in the real and the possible, but acceptable, genuine, made with the materials available, and without apology for their insufficiency. She died as the first pale suggestion of dawn appeared at the edge of the window, which her family would remember and retell as the kind of detail that is too precisely right to be anything but true, the kind of moment that the world occasionally provides to remind us that meaning exists even when it cannot be explained. Her name was Amara. She had chosen it herself in a small house in southern Maryland on a cold morning in November, 1742, and she had worn it for 47 years. And it was the name her children knew her by and her grandchildren after them, and the name that appears, written in a careful hand, in the register of a community that no longer exists in the form it once took but whose record survives, held in the archive of a historical society in Maryland, a small, dense book of names, each one a door, each one a person who arrived by one route or another and said, in the act of writing their name in its pages, that they were here, that they had made it, that they intended to continue. The register is real. The names in it are real. The people who wrote them were real. Each one the center of a life as full and complex and irreducible as the one you are living right now. Each one carrying griefs and loves and histories that deserve to be remembered in their full weight and dimension, not as footnotes, not as context, not as the backdrop against which other stories happen, but as themselves, primary and complete and necessary, to the honest understanding of what this country was and is and what it owes and what has been, despite everything, survived. Amara was one of them. She was not representative. She was not a symbol. She was a specific woman with specific hands and a specific voice and a specific love for a specific man, and a specific grief for a specific woman named Hattie whom she never saw again and never stopped carrying. She was, in the full and literal sense of the word, a person. The kind of person around whom the earth closes when she is gone and holds what she was the way it holds all things, the way Virginia clay holds the memory of everything pressed into it, permanently, patiently, waiting for someone to remember it out loud. This was her story. She deserved to have it told.